August 13th, 1869. We are now ready to start our way down a great unknown. The rushing waters break into great waves on the rocks, lash themselves into a mad white foam. We must run the rapid or abandon the river. There is no hesitation. Major John Wesley Powell, explorer.
John Wesley Powell, the first to descend the Colorado River as it cascaded through the Grand Canyon. In 1869, this was the only blank space still left on the map of the United States. One last place labeled unknown. The Wild West tempted all of man's yearnings. The pursuit of adventure, knowledge, wealth, and power drove the searchers west. They uncovered vast resources, native cultures, and a land more wondrous than any of their dreams.
The government encouraged expeditions to go through the West and explore the areas that were little known and find out just what was there, map the areas, and also discover what kind of natural resources were available for exploitation.
John Wesley Powell was intoxicated with the search, the discovery. A self-educated scientist and Union Army veteran, Powell had lost an arm at the Battle of Shiloh. He was determined that history assign his name to the single remaining geographical mystery, the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. Powell raised the money and outfitted 4 small wooden boats. The expedition set out from Green River City, Wyoming, and followed the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, ending near Las Vegas, Nevada. Powell recorded his impressions in his field notes.
August 14th, 1869. Down these grand, gloomy depths we glide. We listen for falls and watch for rocks, or stop now and then in a bay of a recess to admire the gigantic scenery.
Powell's party had been on the river for nearly 3 months. Each new day, the rapids seemed to become more tumultuous, and many supplies were lost to the churning waters.
August 17th. Our rations are still spoiling. The bacon is so badly injured that we're now compelled to throw it away. We have now only musty flour sufficient for 10 days, and not one of us has an entire suit of clothes, and we have not a blanket apiece.
For 12 more days, Powell and his men plunged onward. Finally, on August 29th, 1869, Powell emerged from the Grand Canyon victorious.
Now the danger is over. Now the toil has ceased. Our joy is almost ecstasy.
The type of accomplishment that Powell made when he successfully explored the Grand Canyon of the Colorado could really be compared to the astronauts today when they go into space.
Powell's next expedition had the full financial support of Congress. Well supplied and full of confidence, Powell even strapped a chair to the deck of one of the boats and read aloud his favorite poems. His voice echoed through the canyon.
So wondrous wild, the whole might seem the scenery of a fairy dream.
Powell's trip was part of what became known as the Great Surveys. Clarence King, a 25-year-old Yale graduate from Rhode Island, led a government survey west to gather data on the natural resources along the 40th parallel.
There is water for irrigation and land fit to receive it. All that is needed is to explore and declare the nature of the national domain. Clarence King, explorer geologist.
The scientists knew they had to charm Congress. And so they took along either painters or photographers or both to record what they saw. And they came back and produced huge portfolios of pictures that would just blow your mind, and gave them as presents to members of Congress, to the cabinet, to the president.
King found evidence of coal in Wyoming, silver in Nevada, and glaciers in California, but regardless of King's findings, it was the photographs that endured. Dr. Ferdinand van der Veer Hayden, the leader of another great Western survey, was a man of inspiring personality and statesmanlike views.
Never has my faith in the grand future that awaits the entire West been as strong as it is at the present time. Ferdinand van de Veer Hayden, explorer, scientist.
One of Hayden's greatest challenges was the search for a mysterious valley French fur traders called Roche Jaune. Hayden knew that the public was captivated by the fantastic reports of geysers and frozen waterfalls. To bring these wonders back to the eastern cities in vivid detail, Hayden took along landscape artist Thomas Moran and photographer William Henry Jackson.
Dr. Hayden had a double motive. The abstract scientist in him wanted more facts to work with, while the practical planner in the man at once saw how a widespread public interest could keep his survey alive permanently. That was where I came in. No photographs had as yet been published, and Dr. Hayden was determined that the first ones should be good. William Henry Jackson, photographer.
At the junction of the Garter and Yellowstone rivers, Hayden's party beheld a white mountain which resembled a frozen waterfall. The mythical land had been found.
On the 28th of July, 1871, we arrive at the lake. The object of all our labors had been reached. Such a vision is worth a lifetime. Ferdinand van de Veer Hayden, explorer and scientist.
The paintings, photographs, and articles from Hayden's survey ignited a national movement to preserve this wonderland, and Yellowstone became the country's first national park. While Hayden explored Yellowstone, the War Department dispatched Lieutenant George Montague Wheeler to explore the territory south of the Central Pacific Railroad. Wheeler also had secret orders to conduct a reconnaissance of the Native American tribes. Wheeler subscribed to the typical frontier soldier philosophy.
The fate of the Indian is sealed. The interval during which their extermination as a race is consummated will doubtless be marked, in addition to Indian outbreaks, with still many more murderous ambuscades and massacres. Lieutenant George Wheeler, U.S. Army.
While the soldiers saw the Indians as a threat, the public viewed them as exotic nomads of the West, a fact not lost on government surveyors hungry for publicity.
They dressed them up to look like white people, and they ended up looking ridiculous. Or they required them to dress up in their finest garments. And so you see photographs of most Indian people, they're not photographs of the average citizen on an average day. They're really pictures of the image of what the white man wanted to see the Indian as.
John Wesley Powell and his photographer John Hillers were no exceptions. When the Paiute Indians were not photogenic enough, Powell had Hillers dress them in different Indian costumes and outfits made by Powell's sister, including fake headdresses. Hillers posed artist Thomas Moran and magazine writer J.E. Colburn with a dressed-up Paiute boy. Powell's cousin Clem wrote this in his diary.
October 4th, 1872. After breakfast, Major Powell, Jacob, Jack, and I drove over to the Paiute camp to picture it. We're at it nearly all day. Braves, squaws, and papooses were done up in most artistic fashion, as also the ancient arrow maker, Clem Powell, Kanab, Utah.
While Hillers and Powell made a healthy profit from the sales of their stereographs, they also had a genuine desire to document the cultures of the ancient West before they were overcome by a flood of white culture. The quest of the searchers was now a race against time.
The blunders we have made and the wrongs we have inflicted upon the Indians have been cruel and inexcusable, except on the grounds of our ignorance. Major John Wesley Powell.
Explorer-scientist John Wesley Powell wanted knowledge of both the Western land and the people that lived there. He believed Native American cultures would soon vanish.
There were people in the tribe that believed that the way that we were living, our way of lives were dying, and that this death was inevitable, and that if the death was inevitable, what was going to be the legacy that went on into the future?
Powell created the Bureau of Ethnology to preserve and study Indian cultures. The organization attracted teachers, scientists, and journalists. Some even began dressing like Indians.
You had anthropologists and ethnologists coming out and saying, define what an Indian is. Tell us what you are. Tell us who you are. And we want to know all your secrets. And they were very intrusive. And more traditional people had little or nothing to do with them ever.
John Gregory Burke was one ethnologist welcomed among the Native Americans. Born to well-educated Irish immigrant parents, Burke became fluent in Greek, Latin, French, and Spanish. And after serving in the Civil War, Burke attended West Point Academy and continued his studies. But his real education began when he was sent west and encountered the Apaches.
The longer we knew the Apache scouts, the better we liked them. They were wilder and more suspicious than the Pimas and the Maricopas, and endowed with a greater amount of courage and daring. Lieutenant John Burke, U.S. Army.
Burke lived with Apache scouts who enlisted with the Army and fought rival Apache clans. Intrigued by the Apache culture, Burke made extensive notes about their language and customs and grew to respect them as tough and resourceful fighters.
The Apache warrior adheres to the same rules of strategy which influenced Napoleon, Wellington, and Grant, although his clothes may be in rags and his belly empty. I have studied the Indian and have tried to account for every action observed on logical principles. I may say without boasting that my notes upon the Apaches are worthy of preservation.
Burke was an inveterate diary keeper, and one day one of the Apache Indians asked another Army officer, "Who does this Burke think he is, a paper medicine man?" Because he's always writing these notes, and the name stuck.
By the late 1870s, John Burke the soldier had truly become John Burke the paper medicine man.
Burke is a very significant individual. He was a man who came west basically to fight Indians, fought Indians, then became a pioneering soldier scientist of Native American cultures, then an advocate for Indian rights who ruined his military career because of his open advocacy of justice for certain Native American groups.
John Burke studied and lived with many tribes: the Navajo, Cheyenne, Lakota, Hopi, and Zuni. The Oglala Lakota chief, Red Dog, invited Burke to document their sacred Sundance, an invitation never before made to a white man.
The display was no less brilliant than fantastic. Calico shirts in the bright hues of the rainbow, leggings of cloth, canvas, and buckskin, crusted with fine beadwork, were worn by all.
This was the most important religious ceremony in the traditional Lakota religion, and they were very adamant that Burke come there, have open access to the ceremony, and record it correctly.
Chief Red Dog told Burke,
"My friend, this is the way we have been raised. Do not think us strange. All men are different. Our grandfathers taught us to do this. Write it down straight on paper. Red Dog, Oglala Lakota Chief."
You speak truly. All men are different. This is your religion. Your religion brought you the buffalo. Ours brought us locomotives and the talking wires. Lieutenant John Burke.
A year after John Burke recorded the Lakota Sundance, another anthropologist was invited to the ceremony. She was a 43-year-old woman named Alice Cunningham Fletcher.
It is certainly a mistake to measure a race solely by the standard of the Anglo-Saxon or modern Western European types. Often these comparative studies keep me awake the better part of the night. Alice Fletcher, anthropologist.
Fletcher was a strong-willed Victorian from New York and a self-taught expert on indigenous American cultures. After lecturing extensively, she was invited to study at Cambridge University. She declined and instead went west in search of the cultures that had captivated her imagination.
I can tell you that lying on the ground in a teepee full of Indians sound asleep and looking up through the opening in the center to the stars stimulates ethnographic reflections.
The city-bred Fletcher withstood the harsh physical demands of her fieldwork. She lived with the Sioux, Winnebago, and Nez Perces, but the tribe she loved the most were the Omahas of Nebraska.
I think they were just somewhat amazed that this lady was there, a white lady too, and taken on an Indian name and tried to learn somewhat of language and to document their history and find it as something important. So they literally took her in.
Frances LaFlèche, a 24-year-old Omaha Indian, was fascinated by the white woman who always wore a black dress. LaFlèche wanted to study anthropology, and Fletcher needed a translator and assistant. So together they formed a partnership. Fletcher, who never married, adopted him as her son.
She has been to me like a real mother. And it was fortunate for me that I became associated with her in her work. Frances LaFlèche, anthropologist.
I think she needed him very much. And also, I think you take a look at from the opposite, he needed her. Simply because, being an Indian, not being accepted in society.
Alice Fletcher believes the Omaha culture was slowly vanishing. Along with Frances LaFlèche, she wrote several articles and a book about Omaha ceremonies, dances, and customs. They also made this extraordinary recording of Omaha music on wax cylinders invented by Thomas Edison.
Some scholars have labeled these ethnologists salvage anthropologists or salvage ethnologists, in that they were trying to salvage knowledge of cultures that they felt would disappear. Perhaps this motivation blinded them from the real resiliency of all of these Native American cultures, which didn't vanish at all.
Several years later, Alice Fletcher returned to Nebraska to see her Omaha friends one last time. It was then she realized the priceless and timeless value of Native American culture.
Living with my Indian friends, I found I was a stranger in my native land. As time went on, a change wrought in me. I learned to hear the echoes of a time when every living thing, even the sky, had a voice. That voice so devoutly heard by the ancient people of America, I desire to make audible to others.
Ethnologists like Alice Fletcher and John Gregory Burke left a legacy of diaries and journals for future generations to study. But while these searchers found a wealth of knowledge, others were out to strike it rich in the Wild West.
I took my shovel, pick, and pan to try a piece of ground. Dreamt I'd struck the richest lead that ever had been found.
January 6, 1859. I went to bed and dreamed of riches galore. I had struck it rich. There were millions in it. George Jackson, prospector.
When Colorado prospector George Jackson hit pay dirt, he reignited gold fever in the West. 10 years had lapsed since the California gold rush, and American searchers jumped at another chance to strike it rich. Jackson's discovery triggered a mining mania that lasted more than 40 years.
Oh, my old banjo hanging on the wall. Case it ain't been tuned since away last fall. But the darkies all say that we'll have a good time when we ride up in the chariot in the morning time.
In many ways, the gold rush and silver rushes in the West were the quintessential frontier experience, and that if most people went to the West to find a better way of life, this promised you to find massive riches overnight.
Everybody wanted to mine. Merchants, teachers, farmers, and occasionally women. All ethnic groups participated. Hispanics, Chinese, Eastern Europeans, Cornish, and African Americans.
When I returned to Los Angeles, I found the people of the town perfectly wild over reports that had come in of rich mineral discoveries in Arizona. Jim Wardner, miner.
Jim Wardner, like many restless young men after the Civil War, moved from Milwaukee to the west in search of gold. He followed one rush after another, from Arizona to Colorado, Idaho, and then finally to Virginia City, Nevada, where the fabled Comstock lode became America's greatest strike of gold and silver.
It was my first experience of a mining stampede, and I caught the fever at once. Jim Wardner, mine.
Hillside's money, and I'm so drunk that I can stand steady. Going up a couple creek, going in a run, going up a couple creek.
Newspaper reporters and land promoters declared a bonanza, and mining camps mushroomed across the frontier. But the living wasn't easy.
Oh, what a miner was I. All swelled up with the scurvy, so I really...
The living quarters were crude, to say the least, and the food was even worse. Beans, bacon, and biscuits were the staple. Many miners came down with scurvy.
I had never felt so before. Sluggish, tired, lazy. I would pity the meanest dog in the world that had the scurvy.
When some men came west, they didn't want to make their wives have to live in this kind of situation. They thought it was too primitive, too crude, and so they left their wife behind. They left their family behind.
But not all women and children stayed home.
They swam the wide rivers and crossed the tall peaks and camped on the prairie for weeks upon weeks. Starvation and cholera and hard work and slaughter, they reached California spite of hell and high water.
By the mid-1870s, most productive mines had been sold to large corporations, and panning for gold had all but disappeared. Prospectors were forced to become hard rock miners and dig deep tunnels to find the precious ore.
In effect, they became wage workers for these large corporations, and they were working in what was essentially an industrial workplace. These were factories under the ground.
Hard rock miners worked under terrible conditions. The mines were deep and dark, ventilation was poor, candles were an unreliable source of light, and temperatures could soar to 120 degrees.
Every day you were underground, you risked your life. It was dangerous. Rocks could fall on your head, obviously. Dynamite could blow up in your face.
And mines could cave in. In Nevada, Frank Crampton and 19 other miners were trapped for over 2 weeks.
Fear was written on every face, as I knew it must have been on mine, but there was no sign of panic. All of us were in for trouble, and there was not one who wasn't scared stiff. Frank Crampton, miner, Goldfield, Nevada.
Ann Ellis knew the hazards of the job well. She was raised in the mining camps of Colorado, and her husband George died in a mining explosion.
George had been taken to the undertaker. When we see him at the cemetery, he is only a form dressed in his clothes, with face and hands all wrapped in white bandages. My children will be as I was, never a father to care for or look out for them. Most of my sorrow was for these fatherless children. Ann Ellis.
Many miners felt $3 to $4 a day was worth the risk, but others felt they deserved more. So some supplemented their income through a practice called high grading.
The richest ore was high grade, and so you stole the richest ore, and you would put that in your false bottom lunch bucket. You would put that in your hollowed out heel of your shoe, or one miner, I can't believe this, I really can't believe it, he had a glass eye. He would take out his glass eye and he would put the rock, the gold ore, in behind the glass eye. And if you can imagine putting that glass back into your eye with that rock behind it and walking out of a mine.
You and me, little brown jug toad, I love thee.
Miners spent their high grading incomes on drinking, gambling, and dancing, even if they had to dance with each other. Former miner Charles Bennett finally struck it rich as a saloon keeper.
When the boys came in from the shift, I said we had 2 kinds of drinks, beer and gin. Well, do you know there was 6 weeks I never saw a bed? I kept right by the saloon and never closed it night or day. Charles Bennett, Arizona.
Miners drank to good health, good luck, and a trusty donkey.
Whoa, mule, I say. Ain't got time to kiss you now, the mule has run away.
Miner Jim Wardner witnessed a donkey named Jackass Jack discover the greatest silver strike in Idaho.
His ears were set forward. His eyes were fixed upon some object. Reaching his side, we were astonished to find the jackass standing upon a great outcropping of mineralized vein matter, looking in apparent amazement at the marvelous ore. Jim Wardner, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
Jackass Jack's owner made millions. And as for Jack, he was the toast of Coeur d'Alene, where the townsfolk named him the $4 million donkey. Only a handful of miners actually became millionaires. Many squandered their earnings on hard living or bad investments. But as mining dried up, another resource waited to be harvested. The searchers had found green gold in the forests of the Wild West.
Oh, what timber. These trees, these forests of trees, so enchain the sense of the grand, so enchant the sense of the beautiful, that I linger on them and am loath to depart. Samuel Wilkeson.
Samuel Wilkeson, a Northern Pacific Railroad agent, marveled at his first glimpse of the great forests of the West. Never had he seen trees of such incredible size. Endless forests of Douglas fir, redwood, and sequoia blanketed much of the frontier from Canada to California and westward from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific shore.
Monarchs, to whom all worshipful men inevitably lift their hats.
The western forests were treasure chests far richer than gold or silver, and news of the big trees spread quickly, attracting new searchers of fortune, the loggers.
50,000 lumberjacks going out to work. 50,000 honest men that never loaf for sure.
They, along with a lot of others in American society, contributed to a materialistic national value. They were taking raw materials, resources, and turning them to profit, and they saw themselves as contributing to the national good in the process, and most of their contemporaries viewed them that way.
Skilled woodsmen transformed the forests into a booming new lumber industry. Soon, the green gold of the West attracted international interest.
Logging generated a tremendous amount of money, and that money built the foundation in which whole wide sections of the far West rests.
The Western timber fever lured experienced lumbermen from the Great Lakes states, Scandinavian loggers from Canada, and shipbuilders from Maine. 16-year-old Swedish logger Emil Engström was eager to chop down his first big tree.
I was given a 7-foot-long bucking saw, a quart bottle of saw oil, an axe, a 10-pound sledgehammer, and 4 7-pound steel wedges. A full load for a strong man. Emil Engström, logger.
The size of the West Coast trees was absolutely mind-boggling. But to these experienced loggers that came from Minnesota and elsewhere, they must have thought they'd died and gone to heaven.
The goal I had in view would require years of hard work, of courage, and stick-to-itiveness. But I knew I could and would succeed. Simon Benson, logger.
Norwegian-born Simon Benson arrived in America penniless at the age of 16. His parents had sent him to America to search for a better life. Benson struck out for the Pacific Northwest.
I bought a ticket on the boat for St. Helens. On the boat, I met John Beavis, who told me he was a lumberman. He said he was looking for a good man. I said, I am a good man. I know the work. I will take the job. Within 2 months, I was able to bring my wife and baby. My boss liked my work.
Him today, if you'd pour some whiskey on it, he would eat a bale of hay.
In the early days of Western logging, men like Simon Benson worked independently or for small logging companies. They were simple men. They were as tough and rugged as their work. There were fallers who cut the trees, bullwhackers whose ox teams pulled the logs, and river pigs who muscled the timber down the rivers to the sea. Cutting and transporting timber was not only strenuous, but dangerous as well. Accidents happened every day. Timberman Tom Mansfield saw his friend become another casualty of the high trees.
I saw him fall 120 feet while going up a fir. He hit the mud feet first. But when they drove him off, he was still smiling and waving his arms as if in victory over death.
One historian did a study and argued in it that logging was actually more dangerous than going to war. Loggers talked about widowmakers. A widowmaker was a dead limb or snag top in a tree that while you're cutting at the base would fall from the tree silently and flatten you. Many a widow was made by a widowmaker.
50,000 lumberjacks sleeping in pole barns. 50,000 odors from dirty socks to skunks.
Logging camps were isolated and primitive. One logger recalled his first night in a logging camp.
I reported to the foreman and asked where I should go. He pointed to the bunkhouse and told me I should build my own bunk. I built something like a bunk and then went down to the barn to rustle straw to fill it. That night, the hard boards and the odor of the hogs kept me awake all night.
But when women and families trickled into the timber camps, life changed for the lonely logger. The bountiful woods provided endless entertainment for children, especially for Simon Benson's daughter, Alice.
When Dad had to cruise timber, he often took me along. For him, the wind in the trees was always a song, and he knew 16 colors of green in the forest. Alice Benson.
Big business also cut its way into the western forests. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, lumber barons from Maine and the Great Lakes states expanded their lumber empires into the west. The independent logger was soon forced to work for others. Simon Benson, however, was an exception among loggers. He scrimped, saved, and in 10 years owned no less than 15 logging camps and his own sawmill. Benson's search for a better life had paid great dividends.
If you have faith in yourself, you can make good. If you have no goal, if you don't know where you are heading for, you will never reach the port of success. Simon Benson, lumberman.
The drive for profit sometimes led to excess. Loggers often chopped down more trees than were actually sold. And as forests became barren and scarred, a new type of searcher emerged. Individuals whose prize was not plunder, but preservation of the Wild West.
June 6, 1869. We are now in the mountains, and they are in us, kindling enthusiasm, making every nerve quiver. John Muir.
John Muir took one look at California's Yosemite Valley and knew he had found his life's work. Muir was a new breed of Western searcher, a naturalist who saw in the wonders of the Wild West a priceless beauty to be saved.
To John Muir, the forests of the High Sierra weren't just raw materials, weren't just something to be turned into lumber and other things of utilitarian value. They had an aesthetic value. And he spent most of the rest of his life propagandizing for the idea that nature ought to be appreciated, not just exploited.
The charms of these mountains are beyond all common reason, unexplainable and mysterious as life itself.
Muir was especially concerned with the great scenic areas of the West that had not been exploited. By the 1870s, railroad tracks ran like haphazard scars throughout the frontier, Mountains were defaced by mining and stripped of timber, and grasslands were overgrazed and overfarmed. The Wild West was not a treasure trove of limitless resources after all.
During the last years of the 19th century, the intense and almost abusive use of the natural resources of the West bred a reaction, and a conservation movement was born in the United States. John Muir was interested in saving a lot of the Sierras and areas of natural beauty and the wild areas, and he was one of the first conservationists.
Indians walk softly and hurt the landscape hardly more than the birds and the squirrels, and their bush and bark huts last hardly longer than those of wood rats. How different are most of those of the white men. Roads blasted in the solid rock, wild streams dammed and tamed. Long will it be ere these marks are effaced, although nature is doing what she can, patiently trying to heal every raw scar.
John Muir's family immigrated from Scotland to Wisconsin when John was 11. His strict, unforgiving Calvinist father forbid any reading except the Bible and demanded all waking hours be spent laboring on the family's frontier farm. But young Muir was remarkably resourceful. He invented all sorts of clocks to help him wake up before dawn so he could read science books, study plants, or invent other wonderful devices.
Springing out of bed at 1 o'clock in the morning, wide awake, no sleep left in a single fiber of me, burning and bright as a tiger springing on its prey.
Seconds numbering. It stopped short, never to go again when the old man died.
Muir's ingenuity led him from the farm to the University of Wisconsin. His first love was botany, but it was more practical to be an industrial inventor at a carriage factory in Indianapolis. There, a fateful accident changed his life.
March 9, 1867. Dear Mother, while connecting a machine belt, I accidentally thrust the point of a file into my right eye last Wednesday, and there is damage. I am completely prostrated, and the eye is lost. John.
Muir's left eye also failed in sympathetic reaction. He was a blind man.
My right eye is gone, closed forever on all God's beauty.
Luckily, Muir slowly regained his sight, but his months spent in darkness created a profound appreciation and need to be close to nature. In search of God's inventions, Muir walked 1,000 miles to visit Yosemite Valley.
A view that breaks suddenly upon us in all its glory, far and wide and deep. A new revelation in landscape affairs that goes far to make the weakest and meanest spectator rich and significant evermore.
Muir immediately set out to measure and examine every aspect of the valley. His theories on glaciers brought acclaim from the country's leading geologists, and his magazine articles defending the wilderness made him the star of the conservation movement.
The trees, the mountains, are not near or far. They are made one, unseparate, unclothed, open to the divine soul, dissolved in the mysterious, incomparable spirit of holy light.
Muir began a campaign to have Yosemite turned into a national park like Yellowstone.
God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanches, and floods. But he cannot save them from fools. Only Uncle Sam can do that.
A year later, Uncle Sam responded, and Yellowstone was declared a national park.
It made thinking people want to know what else was there. It made curious people want to travel there. And it made others very proud of what was in America in the way of physical beauty and remarkable mountains. That this was our answer to Chartres and Notre Dame and places like that. So that I think discovery was that America had something ancient and old and magnificent.
John Wesley Powell's scientific studies of the West became a legacy of vision. His proposals eventually led to the creation of federal land policies and government agencies that are still with us today. John Gregory Burke's journals helped focus international attention on Native Americans and their mistreatment at the hands of the United States government. Anthropologist Alice Fletcher received the prestigious Thaw Fellowship from Harvard University for her work documenting Indian culture, an important honor for any scientist at the time, especially a woman. John Muir continued his search for ways to protect the West. He helped establish a national organization dedicated to the preservation of the wilderness, and to this day, it is called the Sierra Club. The great unknown was now revealed. The searchers had discovered its unfathomed resources, tribal cultures, and fragile beauty. And in their search, they left an everlasting heritage of a uniquely American place, a place forever called the Wild West.